Evening, everyone. Thank you to both organizations for this invitation, and thank you all for attending. So I also want to thank the Center for Arab Culture, specifically Randa and Alma, for all the work they put into this series. And I just want to say that I think this idea, which is a relatively new one of the Center for Arab Culture, namely of what you're calling the human book, but which is basically documenting Arab American lives in the United States, is an absolutely terrific idea. And I don't think it's been done anywhere else. So it's also a novel idea. I can just imagine, say, many years down the line with 200, 300 such events all recorded on a website of some sort. I think this would be a very rich way of crossing bridges and connecting cultures, as the mission statement of CAC, the Center for Arab Culture, states. Now, however, I discovered when I started thinking about how to go about this, it's a much harder thing to do than any of the hundreds of lectures I've given in my life. You might ask why. Because we so-called intellectuals, scholars, professors, whatever you want to call them, are used to hiding behind a subject. There's always something external to us that we talk about. And so although every lecture that anyone gives is personal in that sense, you hide behind the subject that you hide your person behind it. But once I become the subject, it becomes much harder to hide. So where to start, what to include, how intimate to get. These are all really complicated questions when you start to think about doing it. So I ended up choosing a certain way of doing it, and I'll just explain it in a few sentences. I decided to use a set of sharply etched memories. That is, memories that obviously have great importance because they would not go away. I may forget the connections between one memory and the next, or the memories that are part of the humdrum events of life. But these are memories that stay, that almost run like little film clips in my mind. And so I call them sharply etched for that very reason, because they have stuck and they will not go away. So the first such memory, or vignette, call it slice of life, that I'm going to talk about dates back to the late 1950s. I chose to share it with you in part because I think it's particularly relevant to the mission statement of the Center for Arab Culture, namely bridging or connecting cultures. Plus, it's a very important part of my life as well. But first, a little background before I describe the memory. In the mid-1930s, my father, Kanan Makiya, whose archive is being worked on by the two, Sharon was the key person, and Rami is now working on it, and I've just been introduced to Gwendolyn over there, is one of the, I think, largish archives of architects, collection of architects' drawings and work over the years. So in the mid-1930s, my father receives one of the first scholarships of the new Iraqi state, which was born in 1932, as you probably all know. He was supposed to go and study petroleum engineering in England, which he had no intention of doing from the outset, but that's what they wanted. And a few years later, he managed to switch out of it to architecture. In the UK, he met my mother, studying European history. Can I have the first slide? Rami, can I have the first slide? So this, okay, it'll show up. So it's basically a very simple image of my father and mother in the early 1940s in England. The couple, Margaret and Mohammed, soon started living together by the end of the 30s. Margaret working while Mohammed, my father, finished his PhD at Cambridge University. Their principal hobby in those days was bicycling the length and breadth of the UK in order to study its architecture. In 1946, Muhammad, my father, returns to Iraq to work for the government as per the terms of his scholarship, and to find a home suitable for my mother and establish his architectural practice. My mother, meanwhile, had found a position in Baghdad through newspaper ads posted by the British Council. In 1947, she took a ship to Beirut. There she was stuck for a whole month alone because of a cholera outbreak in Baghdad. This was a very different Middle East from the one we know today. And the second image, if it had come up, would show you a poster that reflects that very different Middle East, which has disappeared, unfortunately. Well, it was eventually the month passed, and she made it to Baghdad. And Margaret and Muhammad got married in Baghdad in 1947, where I was born a couple of years later. So the first memory I want to share with you dates back to when I was about 8 years old. And my grandmother, whose picture should come up in a second, on my father's side, is living with us in a newly designed house in the newly established neighborhood of Baghdad called Al-Mansour. So now at this point, we're talking about the mid-1950s, late 1950s. My parents are no longer penniless as they were at the outset. They're comfortably middle class. My father is in the process of founding Iraq's first school of architecture, while my mother is teaching European history at the University of Baghdad. Now, I want you to imagine an 8-year-old version of yours truly walking past a window overlooking his grandmother's bedroom and peeking through it without being noticed. From this vantage point, he sees his mother crouched on the floor, very English-looking mother, dressing the deeply scarred and blotchy legs of his bedridden grandmother. Her diabetes is now at a very advanced stage, and she can't rise from the bed and can't walk. So you have this very English-looking woman kneeling on the floor, unwinding the old bandages of his grandmother's legs, creaming and massaging the cream back into the legs below the knees. And this is, of course, needless to say, a long and laborious project, after which the legs have to be rewrapped in new bandages. Meanwhile, these two women, they couldn't be more different than one another visually, which we'll show in a second, are chatting to one another nonstop. My mother kneeling, as I said, on the floor, speaking in her broken, heavily accented Iraqi dialect, mixed in with English phrases, which my grandmother clearly didn't understand. Looking down on her from on top, so to speak, seated on her bed, is my abaya-wearing, illiterate grandmother chattering away in colloquial Arabic like a house on fire to this total stranger. Did these two women understand what the other was saying? I doubt it. But the point of the story is that it didn't matter. Now, why should a scene like that stick with me at such a young age? Because even at that tender age, I was aware that there was a mystery about my mother, a mystery which she never talked about, but which I had felt, as 8-year-olds can feel, for many years. You see, my mother had been completely cut off by her English family, a rupture engineered by her strict father, the headmaster of a school whom I would never meet. Why? Because he disapproved, of course, of her marriage and didn't want to see her any longer, much less her bastard Arab offspring. But this English grandfather of mine went even further than that. He did everything he possibly could in the coming years to cut her off from everyone else in his family, and that would include her mother and brother. Yes, I even had an English uncle I discovered decades later, and he too had fled from his impossible father and been secretly supported by my mother from her meager earnings until she left for Baghdad. And so I grew up never once meeting a single member of the English side of my family. not once, not ever. And my mother would never talk about this subject. So it was taboo. Not until decades later, when she was forced to return to England in 1974, whereupon within the year she had fallen into a deep depression. What motivated my English grandfather? Class prejudice, still very strong in England of the 1930s, quite possibly the case. After all, in the 1930s, my father was a penniless. That is the first image of my mother and father in the early 1940s in England, before my father would leave to come to Turner. And the next one would be the poster that it hangs in my dining room. And it's a beautiful image. It's a poster from the 1940s, 50s, when this Nairn service, as it was called, we called it Nairn, but it's named after a Scottish Tom Nairn, apparently, who founded the company that ran these buses. And those are the buses my mother would have taken to cross the desert from Beirut after she had spent the month because of the cholera outbreak. And then the next one, the third one, that's my grandmother. That's unfortunately the only image I have of her. So I asked what was motivating the behavior of my English grandfather. Class prejudice was one, or was it racial prejudice? Probably more likely. Why? Because an English woman had fallen in love with an Arab, lived with him for many years outside of marriage in England, going through World War II together, and finally leaving England to work and marry and bear children, not in England, but in Baghdad. They were married also in Baghdad, not in England. Now, keep in mind, England during the interwar period was very different from the much more tolerant and cosmopolitan country we all know today. Pubs actually carried signs saying Jews and Arabs not allowed, Jews and Arabs not allowed. And my father used to tell me that he had been called, not infrequently, towelhead. That was the, expression. I don't need to explain what that remark means. Now, I said in the talk that my mother was forced to leave Baghdad. Why forced? Because in 1971, a bogus arrest warrant had been issued for my father, along with about 400 professionals like him, by the newly installed Ba'athi regime. Fortunately, he was overseas when the arrest warrant came out, and one of his students warned him in advance not to return, so he never suffered years in prison as some of the other professionals did. It was left to my mother, with the help of a small army of her own Iraqi students, very devoted Iraqi students, to pack everything up, outwit the authorities, and make her way to my father, now waiting for her in his new office in Bahrain. Decades later, my mother told my eldest daughter, Bushra, who happens to be here today, speaking of her quarter of a century spent in Baghdad, they were, quote, the happiest years of my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to go back to that 8-year-old spying upon the women in his life through the window. If my mother had been rejected by the world into which she had been born, how was she being received by the world into which she had immigrated? In other words, what about the abaya-wearing, the other woman in that scene, my illiterate abaya-wearing grandmother, who you see in the picture? Everything good, let's use that generic word for a second, and interesting, let's say, that I learned about Islam before leaving Iraq came from this woman. None of it came from school. And even though I was a very obedient and hardworking student and studied all the mindless, stupid textbooks that I was given on the subject. But what I learned from my grandmother came in the shape of stories, not history lessons. Absolutely no speeches about the greatness of Islam, no talk of civilization, just stories, simple stories in which characters, including prophets and khalifas, emerge as people, not as saints. This woman took her Islam for granted, like the clothes you see her in. She wore her religion unselfconsciously, never in your face. Sitting on the side of her bed, she regaled me with stories while I was growing up. Folklore, really, not what you would call history, not even strictly speaking. There were stories from the Quran or about the tradition, but not really preaching in any way, shape, or form. And I imagine her stories were being like the stories that early Muslims told one another in the first centuries of Islam, first couple of centuries, long before anything was written down by writers like me, professionals, I mean, with, let's face it, always one axe or another to grind. Can I have the next slide? Decades after her death, I published my first novel in the year 2000. Now move on. That's my mother. That's the two of them sitting together. And let's move on. Yeah. No, forward. Yeah. Again, yes. I published my first novel, whose picture you see here. This is the year 2000. Novel. I had written other books, but I want to mention this one before I move on. Whose cover you see on the screen. It tries to tell stories. I mean, it hopes to succeed in telling stories picked at random from all the three great monotheistic traditions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. It did not matter to me in the making and the shaping of this book how true these stories were to historical fact. All that mattered is that they were there in the tradition and therefore became like legitimate pieces of a much larger mosaic or building blocks for the story of why early Muslims had wanted to build such a remarkable building as the Dome of the Rock, which Professor Nasser had in our last talk discussed. We both of us have an equal fascination, and I remember him giving me his article way back when I was working on this in the late 1990s. So I wanted my stories, thus assembled in the manner in which I just described, to enchant the way my grandmother's stories had at the time enchanted me. And my point is that at a deeper level, my grandmother's kind of storytelling lies at the heart of all the great religions. Stories that get handed from one generation to the next, changing each time they are written down, and then frozen in place, so to speak, now cloaked sometimes in the guise of God's truth, the kind of truth that men, and they are always men, sometimes turn into the cruel and ugly thing we see paraded all over the Middle East today. My grandmother would not have understood such men. Her Islam bore no relation to theirs. But I digress. What I'm trying to say is that this profoundly religious woman, who only ever wanted someone to do the pilgrimage to Mecca on her behalf because she could no longer walk, carried her religion into everything and who she was. Yet it was she who opened her arms to my cast-out mother and embraced her. And when I say embraced, I mean quite literally smothered her with kisses in front of other people. The first time Muhammad, my father, introduced Margaret, my mother, to his mother, Bahia, in 1947. And it is almost certainly because of my illiterate grandmother that half a century later, my mother would tell my daughter, Bushra, whose middle name is Bahia, and I don't need to tell you why, that her quarter of a century in Iraq had been the best years of her life. So much for the first memory. The second sharply etched memory I can date much more precisely, to a handful of days after February 8, 1963, the date of the first successful Ba'athi coup that overthrew the 5-year-old regime of Brigadier Abdul Karim Qasim, who had himself overthrown the monarchy in 1958. The problem the new coup makers faced was that Qasim was very popular, especially with the residents of Madinat al-Thawra, nowadays known as Madinat al-Sadr. Who were these people? They were the formerly rural urban migrants from southern Iraq who dwelt in absolutely abysmal conditions in mud huts called sarifas, with no electricity or running water and absolutely no services whatsoever. Qasim had built, during those 5 years, proper modern housing for them. And they not only worshipped him, but they refused to believe he was dead. So the Ba'ath were faced with a conundrum. They had come to power. The regime would only last 9 months. This is the first Ba'athi regime. Television was new to Iraq. So Iraq's leader, led by a faction on the extreme left of the Ba'ath party, decided to air from late afternoon to the early evening, prime time, in other words, a half-hour film clip displaying Qasim's bullet-ridden corpse. I will now read a short passage from this book, my first, finished in 1986, only to be rejected for 3 years by several dozen publishers based in the UK and USA, until finally the University of California Press took on the risk of publishing it under a pseudonym in 1989, when it appeared for the first time. The passage that I will read from you comes from this book, describes this 1963 Ba'athi contribution to television history in Iraq. So I'm now quoting from the second chapter. Night after night, they made their gruesome point. The body was propped up on a chair in the studio. A soldier sauntered around, handling its parts. The camera would cut to scenes of devastation at the Ministry of Defense, where Qasim had made his last stand. There on location, it lingered on the mutilated corpses of Qasim's entourage, Al-Mahdawi, Wasfi Tahir, and others. Back to the studio, and close-ups now of the entry and exit points of each bullet hole. The whole macabre sequence closes with a scene that must remain forever etched on the memory of all those who saw it. The soldier grabbed the lolling head by the hair, came right up close, and spat full face into it. This is a scene that forever remained etched on the memory of this 13-year-old. But I never talked about it until I wrote those words in the 1980s. The Ba'ath aired the film clip over and over again. And don't ask me why, but I watched it over and over again. My parents tried to stop me. Perhaps they didn't try hard enough. Anyway, like all teenagers, I had my ways of escaping their watchful eye. Keep in mind, I was utterly non-political when I watched this film. I had not yet had a single political thought or impulse, other than that picked up in the background of the great novels of 19th century Russian literature, which were an obsession of mine in those years. Books like Tolstoy's War and Peace and Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I was delighted to hear, again, the parallels between my life and Professor Rabat sitting here. He too was reading those novels at about the same age I read them in Baghdad. In my case, this kind of literature was a form of escape. Back then, I was a ridiculously shy and overweight boy, inside of whom lurked an extrovert just itching to come bursting out. Consider my best friend at that time, Basil Shawaf. Basil's mother was German, and his father had been an Iraqi officer forced into retirement in 1941 after having had something to do, I never knew what exactly, with the Rashid Ali al-Gailani coup. They had met, Basil's mother and father, in Berlin, the 1930s, about the same time that my parents had met in Liverpool, England. You could say Basil was everything I was not: handsome and tall, an extrovert, and a great athlete, fluent in 4 languages, but hopeless at math and science. And that's usually where I fitted in. Moreover, he was popular and comfortable around the girls, which I was not. And those kinds of things mattered a lot at that age. Was it pure coincidence that we had become friends and both had European mothers? Of course not. Building bridges and connecting cultures, you might say, was woven into both our DNA, his and mine, metaphorically speaking. We were both outsiders of a sort, looking in. Not because anyone mistreated us in Iraq, quite the opposite. Our genetic, so to speak, connection to Western civilization through our mothers often turned us into objects of admiration in those days. Still, Nonetheless, it is not pleasant or desirable to be an outsider when one is young. Say, among your cousins, in my case. You could say Basil and I lived at a slight angle to everyone else's life. And this is not desirable at an age when you want nothing more than acceptance by your peers. Later in life, however, it provides you with a different vantage point from which you can see things perhaps others cannot. Speaking of the 1960s, I sometimes wonder whether Dostoevsky's great work, The Demons, played a role in my early fascination with the darkness of the Ba'ath Party displayed in the gruesome spectacle I have just described from that book. In this novel, namely The Demons by Dostoevsky, political ideas in particular, political ideas in particular, are the demons of the title. And it is these ideas, that lead young men to acts of terrorism that are simultaneously murderous and farcical, tragic and yet stupidly funny. The novel describes 19th century Russian anarchists, but it might as well be describing young men from our own Arab world, men like Muhammad Atta from Egypt and Ziad Jarrah from Lebanon, both of 9/11 fame. And in Raskolnikov, the murderous hero of Crime and Punishment, again it is Dostoevsky who anticipated the notion of the philosophical killer. The man, again, why is it always a man? But it is. The man who acts violently out of what he sees as high principle. Dostoevsky had himself once been such a person. In the course of my adult life, I would return to Dostoevsky over and over again, to the point that in my last book, Fil Qaswa, on cruelty, written 3 years ago in Arabic this time, I named one of its chapters Afkar Shaytaniya, a title straight out of Dostoevsky. My mother had, needless to say, pushed English literature my way from very early on. But our whole house was a library, which meant that I did not have to travel far to get absolutely anything and whatever I was looking for, even if my mother didn't want me to read it. Lady Chatterley's Lover, for example. And I freely admit I was fixated on books, quite possibly in an unhealthy way. I remember reading Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I don't know if you know I won't bother to explain it. But reading it and breaking down in uncontrollable tears late at night at Tess's anguish, she is abused, to be followed by anger at the general hypocrisy of Victorian England. Was I thinking of what my mother had suffered at the hypocrisy of her own father? Because it was that very same hypocrisy that featured in all of Thomas Hardy's, Charles Dickens, and George Eliot's novels. I don't know. I only know that books became a kind of substitute for real life. I lived through them, not with them. But I no longer wanted to do that. In fact, I itched to come bursting out of my cocoon. Decades later, a very wise New York editor singled out the passage from Republic of Fear that I have just read out to you. So here he said it was the best written paragraph in the whole 323-page book. The phrase I recall him using was that, Kanan, this is the book's beating heart. I recall being offended at the time, thinking I had worked 6 years full-time to write that book. I had quit the practice of architecture, upsetting my father no end because he expected me to inherit his office. I left London, selling my house next door to my parents to gain distance from my whole London world in order to write it. What was I running away from? I was running away not only from family and friends, but also from my own former political and activist self of the previous decade. True, during the 1970s, I had read Marx, Engels, and Trotsky as voraciously as I had read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in the 1960s. But by the late 1970s, it was clear to me that Marxism had completely failed to explain three seminal events that were going on roughly at the same time: the Lebanese Civil War, the Islamic nature, the Islamic Iranian Revolution, and above all, the third, the Iraq-Iran War. Now, remember the scale of that last war. Keep in mind that while I was starting to research Republic of Fear, Donald Rumsfeld was visiting Baghdad, shaking Saddam Hussein's hand at the airport. And the ugliest and biggest war since World War II, the Iraq-Iran War, the first really big war of the so-called Third World, was being fought, killing in the course of 8 years nearly 1 million Iraqi and Iranian men. That is more dead human beings than had died in all the Arab-Israeli wars rolled into one at that point in time. In all three of these earth-shattering events, civil war in Lebanon, the Islamic character of the Iranian Revolution, and the Iraq-Iran War, the left I had belonged to was clueless. It had failed to understand the nature of the Lebanese civil war, describing killing people on the basis of their religion as a war between progressives and reactionaries. It had failed to understand the Islamic nature of the Iranian Revolution, or take it into account in any way, shape, or form. And it had taken sides in the Iraq-Iran War, which was, I thought, absolutely the wrong thing to do. And so, like a house of cards, my former politics began to tumble down. Working on Republic of Fear, therefore, was more than just another book. For me personally, it was a kind of journey, taking me into the unknown, taking me away from the past towards what I am, perhaps now, a rather old-fashioned 18th century liberal for whom suddenly the cruelties of the political world he had been born into loomed large. I had done all these things, including describing the nature of the regime that launched that war. And along comes a fancy, all-important New York editor, a man whom budding young writers would kill to work with, and he is telling me at the heart of my manuscript, its soul, so to speak, was one solitary paragraph describing what I had seen when I was 13 years old. It felt like he was belittling everything I had done and the price I had paid in order to do it. But of course, he was right and I was wrong. And I understood how right he was after Saddam Hussein invaded, occupied, and annexed the state of Kuwait, leading, ironically, to the book's becoming a New York Times bestseller. I say ironically because in the previous 12 months, between Republic of Fear's publication in 1989 and Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, it had sold a mere few hundred copies. And most likely, had Mr. Saddam not gone into Kuwait, it would continue to have only sold at those sorts of numbers. And most of these copies had been bought by who? By officials in Iraqi embassies across the world, and one individual Iraqi, unknown to me at the time, a man who was an implacable foe of Saddam. This man had personally bought 100 copies, an unheard of purchase by a private individual, which he then proceeded to distribute to members of the American Congress on the on the eve of the 1991 Gulf War. So much for the second vignette memory. The third and last vignette is my first political experience, by which I mean that it does not come out of a television screen as in 1963 or the pages of a book. It took place on the cusp of leaving Iraq for the United States to attend MIT here as a freshman. More significantly, it happened on the second or third day of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, a war whose legacy would not only go on to shape my worldview, but that of my whole generation. The memory begins with a group of us Baghdad College High School graduates meeting on the main steps of our high school, which we did in the summer because they had beautiful grounds and tennis courts and fields and so on. We were hotly discussing, needless to say, the ongoing war. Baghdad radio had been broadcasting stories of how Arab armies were winning, citing the numbers of downed Israeli fighter jets. Hundreds, I recall the number was. These had supposedly been shot down by our brave Arab pilots. My friends were all very excited to the point of speculating on the imminent demise of the Zionist state. The problem was that in my house, during crises, my parents always listened to the BBC World Service. And I knew from the BBC that we were losing, not winning this war. I knew that all the bombast and exhortation coming from Baghdad radio and Sawt al-Arab fil Qahira was nonsense. In fact, the bulk of the Egyptian Air Force had been destroyed in the early hours of the war. So I said this to my friends, to be met by utter disbelief and consternation at my failure to be patriotic. Of course, I lost the heated debate that then ensued, but remained unconvinced. And that, you could say, is the story of my life. I mean, ending up in a minority for saying or writing things other people do not want to hear, which is what I want to do big time in this book published in 1993. Can I have the next slide, Rami, please? It was a very short distance from my first political experience in 1967 to throwing myself into political activity of every shape and description at this great institution, MIT. My years at MIT were truly the best of my life, to paraphrase my mother. They opened my eyes to the world. This country was in turmoil with civil rights, anti-Vietnam War movements, the women's movement, and the so-called youth rebellion, to say nothing of solidarity with the then rising star of the Palestinian resistance movement, all of which I threw myself into, body and soul. Now, during those years, I had mentors of every type and description. And there's no time to go into the story of that 10 years. But I do want to mention one person whose way of thinking I yearn to emulate, Sadiq Jalal al-Adham, a Marxist Syrian philosopher who published within months of the end of the 67 war, a book I always admired greatly, النقد الذاتي بعد الهزيمة, self-criticism after defeat. Notice Sadiq calls the Arab defeat in 1967 a hazima, for which he was much criticized at the time. You see, a hazima is not a normal defeat. It is a rout, a humiliating defeat. I don't even know what the English equivalent would be. But a hazima is what 1967 undoubtedly was. Even Nasser had the grace and courage to admit that by resigning. And the beginning of wisdom, I thought at the time, and still do, was being able to admit to the fact of defeat. Consider also that some of the titles, other titles of Sadiq's books. Naqd al-Fikr al-Dini. For this book, he was tossed out of the most liberal university in the Arab world in those days, the American University of Beirut, where he was a professor. Or Naqd Fikr al-Muqawa al-Falastiniya, written critique of the thought of the Palestinian resistance movement, written at a time when he and I, following in his footsteps, were members of Ansar al-Jabha al-Demokratiya al-Falastiniya in the United States, supporters of the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine in the United States. Now, Sadiq himself at the time never knew I held him in such high regard. He was, after all, maybe 20 years my senior, and I was too shy to introduce myself to him in meetings of Ansar al-Jabha al-Demokratiya. Much later, after the publication of this book, shortly after it, we met and talked. And this followed a lecture I gave about the book. And then it was, he knew, because I told him, how much I was indebted to him. Not so much for what he had written. I often disagreed with some of his arguments, but for his stance on self-criticism, naqd al-dhati. This was a man who had faced up to his own culture's demons, and that is where I have always held an intellectual's main obligation lies. In that sense, he and I were kindred spirits. He may still have remained a Marxist, which I no longer was, but after the horrors I had seen in northern Iraq in 1991 and chronicled in this book, that no longer mattered. Yes, I was angry when I wrote Cruelty in Silence, and you should never write or say anything when you are angry. But sometimes you can't help it. I couldn't help it any more than George Orwell, a socialist, could help himself when he pilloried his fellow British socialists for apologizing for Stalin's purges of the 1930s, or Émile Zola when he wrote J'accuse, blaming the French army for its anti-Semitism. Moreover, I wrote Cruelty in Silence on the heels of coming out of a traumatic 8-week journey, crossing illegally from Turkey into northern Iraq in the fall of 1991, right on the heels of the first Gulf War. The things that I saw during those 8 weeks and experienced in face-to-face ways in Iraqi Kurdistan, not this time, of course, on a television screen, but face-to-face with people whose suffering at the hands of the Ba'ath, words simply could not describe. So in this book, I do not even try to describe that suffering. I let those victims' words do the writing for me. So the first 2/3 of the book is largely that. Yes, in those days, collecting testimonies of pain and suffering under the regime of the Iraqi Ba'ath probably got under my skin. I wrote the book in a frenzy, like a madman, working all hours, 7 days a week, jumping from one country to the next, recording interviews with the victims. My children, no doubt, paid the price. I was not there for them during those years. But mine was not an anger directed this time at the Iraqi regime, the perpetrators of those crimes. It was an anger directed at my friends and fellow travelers on the left, Arab and non-Arab, because they would not acknowledge those crimes, or more accurately, put them where they belonged, or where I thought they ought to belong, at the forefront of their politics. And when, can I have the next slide? And when the New York Review of Books, for which I would write many articles, reviewed that book, Cruelty in Silence, it featured this cartoon. Republic of Fear had been a journey of change, driven by the need to understand what we Iraqis had done to ourselves. Implicitly, its argument was that Saddam Hussein was one of us. He was the demon inside each and every one of us, Iraqis. We had no one to blame for the phenomenon he was but ourselves. And everyone was complicit in one way or another, be they Arab or Kurd, Shia or Sunni. Cruelty in Silence, on the other hand, was a document that tried to bridge the gap, not between cultures, but between our Arab rhetoric, our way of talking about ourselves, our politics, and our painful reality. Rubbing my friends' noses in that gap and trying to close it has perhaps been the common denominator of a lot of my work. Perhaps I sometimes faced up to it too harshly. I admit to that fault, now especially, much older and looking back. Nonetheless, isn't it odd that without realizing it, I seem to have been battling the same dilemma in the 1990s when I wrote Cruelty in Silence that I faced in 1967 on the steps of my high school in Baghdad College. So much had changed between 1967 and 1993, and yet, in a sense, nothing had changed. And so you might ask, what of Iraq, the country at the center of it all, and the culture that had embraced my mother when her own had cast her out? In the first 10 years after the 67 war, I did not think much about Iraq. I was too involved in saving the world. I am aware of the irony and conceit in that remark, but I was young, and one must live one's dreams at that age. But living in that dangerous utopia also meant that Iraq was in those days a secondary, not a primary focus. By the end of the 1970s, that was hard to sustain. Terrible stories were coming out of this poor, poor thing called Iraq that I had shunted to second place for so long. But when I re-entered Iraq illegally, this time in 1991, through Turkey with a Welsh friend of mine, a filmmaker named Gwyn Roberts, the situation was worse, much, much worse than it had been in the late 1970s. The film Gwyn and I made covered the Anfal campaign of mass murder waged by Saddam against the Kurds. And it was in the eye of the hurricane that was the first Gulf War and its bloody aftermath, the Intifada, where more than 200,000 people were killed, that I made that emotionally supercharged journey into northern Iraq, after which I threw myself in a frenzy into writing Cruelty and Silence. Now, imagine how you would feel locating and interviewing a young 12 or 13-year-old boy named Taimur, who managed to survive being buried in a mass grave on the Iraqi-Saudi border near the town of Samawa. He had succeeded in digging himself out of the shallow mass grave at dusk after the shooting had stopped, because he had only been hit in the arm and was not too seriously wounded. His mother and sisters were dead and buried alongside. Rubble and dust and sand had been thrown over the bodies. So he had to work himself around their bodies to exit the grave. Now imagine yourself questioning him and then feeling ashamed of yourself for having done so. And then ask, is it any wonder that Cruelty and Silence is an angry book? What can I say at the end of it all? I like to say I tried to do what my grandmother would have wanted me to do. Tell the truth, my son, she would have said. She always called me a son. Tell the truth, no matter the consequences. You see, the truth in her mind was a very simple thing. It had not yet been postmodernized out of existence. For my grandmother, it was solid and objective, not blowing in the wind, as Bob Dylan sang. There's nothing true and more final and solid than cruelty and death. Just ask the people of Gaza today, or the Iraqi Kurds who died in the Anfal, or the couple of 100,000 who died in the crushing of the Intifada in the year 1991. But my grandmother would have added, yes, tell the truth, my son, only make sure you are telling it out of love. Thank you.
Hello, Kanan.
Hello, Annie.
I very much admire the fact of your courage and saying what you believe is correct, irrespective of the outcome and irrespective of what the others will feel about it. Now, let me come to my question. Following the World War I, the Arab world in the form that we witnessing now, I see it now, they experimented for a short period with liberalism, Western liberalism. Then they shifted into communism, then nationalism, and Islamism, as we see now. The question that puzzled me is that now I see that the Arab world lacks an ideology. What do you feel the ideology that's most suitable for the Arab world as is now?
That's a huge question.
It's a huge question, I know, but if Kanan cannot answer it, do you think I can answer it? Thank you.
It is, first of all, it's not for me to answer on behalf of the Arab world such a question. I can only do what I've always done, which is say, this is where I stand, this is what I think, etc. Oh, sorry. I can only say what I would have done, what I would put forward. So I really, there are times in societies when you simply have to work through various ideologies, and we have now worked through all of them. There's nothing left. So you're right, there's a vacuum at the moment, a vacuum of ideas. And you won't find any solutions in people of my generation, or even the generation younger. You have to go much younger than that to see creative and interesting new ways of thinking about the world that might lead to a more tolerant, more civic-centered discourse, and finally politics. So I would say the answer to your question lies not in politics, but it lies in culture. And I already see amazing examples of young Arabs, young Iraqis that I correspond with quite a bit, who are really thinking in completely new ways through the internet and because of the internet, not because of their teachers, not because of their political leaders and so on. Everywhere we look, we see bankrupt regimes. In fact, we are losing states in the Mashriq. Iraq is barely holding on to the idea that it constitutes a state when it's run by a bunch of militias. But Syria is virtually without a state, and Lebanon and the Palestinians have not yet had a state. So the Mashriq, which was the cradle of civilization for so long, is today at worse off than the Gulf, where it was historically always looked down upon the Gulf. The answer lies in young people, in youth, in a new generation, one less than half my age onwards. And we have to watch them. And when they ask us questions, answer and contribute here and there in different ways. That's the best we can do.
Thank you, Professor Makiya. I can listen to you all day about Baghdad of the 60s during my time with my parents. You spoke briefly about what it was like growing up as a half Englishman in Baghdad, but I'd like to hear how did that affect your experience of coming to the United States in the late 60s as half Arab, and did having an English mother impact that?
I never thought of myself as half Arab. I thought of myself as Arab, for partly, but partly that's explained by the talk. So I had an English mother, so I was an Arab who had this unusual, part of his life that his mother was not an Arab, and my mother was by the end very fluent in Arabic. So I never thought of myself that way. When I jumped into the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the 70s, or Ansar al-Jabha Demokratiya that I mentioned earlier, I did so fully as an Iraqi, as an Arab, not thinking of myself in any way ever as an Englishman. I love English culture, I enjoy England, we used to go in the summers and visit England, etc. But perhaps that has something to do with the way my mother was cast out. That may be the answer. But I know that it was true of my best friend, Basil al-Shawaf, whom I mentioned earlier. He too always felt himself an Arab. It didn't make much of a difference that our mothers were European. I wouldn't change a thing about any of that. So.
Thank you, Kanan, for sharing with us these wonderful, intense memories. I actually learned a lot about you, even though I thought I knew you. I am going to ask you to go back to something that, to me, defined you in your mind when you said in 1967 you were the outsider looking in, or you felt to be the outsider looking in. And I wonder if you see yourself almost in the different stages of your life as an outsider looking in. And I'll give you two examples and perhaps you would react to them. One is that you are the Arab intellectual who is outside the horde of Arab intellectual looking into Arab intellectualism and critiquing it. You're one of a very few, as you explained to us. The second is that you are an Arab intellectual in a very hostile West, and you are looking into basically how the hostile West is treating the Arab world. So am I correct in actually seeing you always as this one outside and looking in? And if I'm not, why?
As a general observation, I think you are correct. As I've always been some sort of an outsider, always in a minority in a group, but looking in. But first, I pointed out the difficulties that poses for a teenager, my teens. Put that aside. In general, it's not such a bad position to be in. I mean, think of, for instance, the contribution that exiles made, say European exiles who came to this country after World War II. They did. They contributed phenomenally. So now what I have never. I see here. Okay, let me put it this way. I've never thought myself American. I ended up with an American passport 9 years ago. I had a British passport, but I only had a British passport because the Iraqis would not renew my Iraqi one. I had to go back, so I was stateless for 2 years. I couldn't even get the fact that I had a British mother didn't even mean I had the right to the British nationality. I had to apply for it like everybody else. Margaret Thatcher changed the rules so that if your mother, the rules used to be that you only got a nationality through your father. So I never got the British. I had no right to the British nationality by law. So I got the British nationality, which was a very useful, convenient, needless to say, thing to have. Currently, I have 3 passports now. Iraqi, which they returned to me happily after 2003, and British and American. I was more a part of this country on a day that I'll describe to you. It was a very important day. The day that Martin Luther King was shot. I was a student here at MIT. MIT, the whole institution, dropped everything. And students and faculty throughout these corridors and right in the main hall especially, started working on an exhibition of Martin Luther King's work, his life, his speeches, etc. I hardly knew who, it really was in either my freshman or sophomore year, I can't remember now, 67, 68. When was Martin Luther King shot? Martin? No, wait.
1968.
Yes, 68. There you are. I was a sophomore. So that year, somebody else was, Kennedy was killed in. So I threw myself into that activity, hardly knowing who he was, but learning as I went along. Perhaps on that day, I've felt American for a while, but it isn't where I spent 90% of my activities. That came and went, and it was a wonderful experience. So did many other international experiences. It could be that my being on the margins, my being an insider looking in, my being always in a minority. By the way, in almost every, it's peculiar. I seem to always end up, even if it's not in the Arab context, even if it's in the context of, for a while as I said, I was a Marxist. I was a member of the Fourth International, the International Marxist Group, the British section of the Fourth International. But even there, I was usually in a minority. But that doesn't matter. That I don't know why that happens. In an important sense, I think I've gained more than I've lost by sort of having been situated by life in that position. So I have no regrets. I mean, it's true. If you're in a minority, you wish to be with the majority. But if something is holding you back, and that something is and you have a belief or principle forcing you into that position, then you fight back, and you assert your minority position. So my answer to you now, a fight that has not yet been my fight, is the fight of Arab Americans in the United States to be treated properly, to be not discriminated against, and so on. A fight that is so germane to everything that's happening right now all around us in this country, with the fighting in Gaza and so on. That's very germane. I was always orientated outside. You see, here's an interesting difference between me and Edward Said. Edward critiqued this society from the standpoint of an American, but a critical American. Fuad Ajami, for example, did not want to relate to his Arab roots. He actually occasionally said so. He thought himself an American. He saw himself as an American and thought that's what he changed his Hawiya, his identity. He changed who he was. He decided that he was more American than he was an Arab. Edward was an American who adopted his Arabness starting in 1967. Again, like me. So I always thought and operated as though I was in the Arab world, although I was not. I was here, there, England, or everywhere. But I couldn't be in Iraq, so I was always somewhere else. And I operated on the basis of that somewhere else. So you could say, later in life, I started to face a very difficult question. I mean, what does patriotism mean in my case? I have defended Iraq. I have supported Iraqis. I have supported the victims. Am I patriotic, or am I so internationalized that that word no longer applies to me? If you see what I mean. I don't know if I'm making sense. But I have, and that's why I ended the talk the way I did. I think I have functioned on the basis that I loved the people of the country that embraced my mother, put it that way. I think that's how I've always operated. So you could never criticize me so I criticized like hell, the Ba'ath, and anywhere I saw injustice, but always my Iraqiness, or in the name of Iraqiness. But the marginal dimension of my life is a very interesting, complicated thing. For a long time, I struggled with it in the 90s. What was I? Should I speak as an Iraqi? Should I speak as you see, the problem, and the problem was not even of my making. In this country, the media turn you into one thing or another. Because I wrote Republic of Fear, all of a sudden I was a spokesperson of the Iraqi opposition. Nonsense. I never nobody appointed me, or I spoke for the Iraqi people, or I spoke for I spoke again, in the name of Iraq. So they would bring me on TV shows and radio shows and so on and so forth to speak as though I was representing them. But I represented nobody except myself. But the media creates, I am sure, although we never talked about it, Edward suffered from the same paradox. He was forced into being the representative of the Palestinians when he's not the Palestinian representative. He's different. He's as different from a common denominator of what it means to be a Palestinian, if there is such a thing, as I'm different from the common denominator of what it means to be Iraqi. But I always was uncomfortable when I would be called. We're now going to hear from the Iraqi opposition, Mr. Kanan Makiya, blah, blah, blah. I didn't represent anybody. I only ever represented Kanan Makiya, and like you rightly said, I was always in a minority and I was always on the margins. But that's life. Well, I don't know what to say. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I've worked my way around it. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm not the moderator. Yeah.
Thank you, Alma. I just wanted to thank you for, is this on? I just wanted to thank you for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it, and I congratulate you for being at the right place at the right time so many times. But in writing these books, did this help you process your trauma? I'm curious about your trauma, and from such a young age, and then, in 91, some of
the trauma,
those
experience.
Yeah, but even what happened at 13 seems like it was so violent and so, formative to your socialization. But how did writing the book help you deal with the trauma, and I ask that because there's just so much regular trauma, generational trauma, cultural trauma in all of these countries that you've described. And
it's the trauma would have been of all Iraqis. I think Iraq post 2003 is a highly traumatized society. It has not yet, and it's going to be a very long time before it does, processed the violence that was inflicted on extremely large numbers of people at different times, in different places, in different circumstances. So remember, this was primetime television that film clip was shown. Hundreds of thousands of millions, if not, saw it. I mean, they even put televisions in coffee shops and so on, and people would watch it. If they didn't have the money to buy a television set, they would watch it. So that I have known many Iraqis, unlike me, they don't have English mothers, for example. It's got nothing to do with it, who were traumatized by things. For instance, as soon as the Ba'ath came to power, they in 1968, they imagined that they were going to find the fifth column responsible for the defeat. They didn't call it defeat, but they're responsible for the betrayal of the 1967 war. Now, the Iraqi army itself had never actually even made it to the border before the war was finished. So they were, I think the Israelis bombed some Iraqi units that made it to the border, and that was it. So no Iraqi had actually suffered anything from the 67 war. But they came to power saying they were going to find the fifth column responsible for the defeat. And lo and behold, they cobbled together many, but at least 13 poor, pathetic individuals, of whom 9 were the tiny remnants of Iraq's Jewish community, and hung them up in public on Tahrir Square, leaving the bodies hanging for many days and holding carnivals all around it. A young woman that I grew up with, her brother was another friend, goes to school in the Rahbat. It's called the nuns' school. They had a school right near Tahrir Square. And she walked by this. She had to walk. That woman went into psychiatric treatment when she fled Iraq. She had to be treated in England, is where she finally settled. So I'm just giving it as an example of a trauma that's much bigger. Now, what I witnessed in the 8 weeks I spent in Iraq, see here also, the contrast is really important. The last time I had been to Iraq was 1967. I left 67. I returned in the summer of 68 just because to be with my parents, see my parents. And then that's it. I hadn't been to Iraq throughout because I was a persona non grata. My father was, they had cooked up some nonsense about my father, who was the most apolitical, non-political person you can imagine. He has nothing to, he's not interested in politics, not even vaguely. So, he and others were found and accused of being Masons. Freemasons. So 400. The average age of the people that they had in the list, it'll bore you if I tell you the whole story, but sometimes these things are so strange. They're so funny, they're strange. The average age was in the 70s and 80s of the people that they picked up. People spent 1, 2, 3 years in prison. And what's Freemasons? How did they come up with the idea? Well, there's a funny story, but I don't want to miss the point. So I hadn't been back to Iraq from that summer of 1968 until that fall of 1991, when I went in, because I had been shown a tiny little video clip, about 5 minutes long, of this Kurdish boy who I described, called Taimur. So I'd been shown this film, and he was being used for propaganda purposes by the Kurdish militia groups, the PUK and the KDP. They sat him up like a little soldier with a Kalashnikov right here. This is a 13-year-old, for God's sake, and a Kalashnikov here, dressed him in army fatigues, and then asked him questions. And then but I realized, if it's true, if what this boy is even roughly true, somebody needs to properly interview him. And that was actually one of the main reasons for my forcing the boy to talk. And I felt terrible about myself afterwards for doing that. And I saw other things, really. I mean, all sorts of horrors. There's no other word to describe it. I interviewed more than 50 people on that trip. Yes, that resulted. I don't know enough about trauma to know if I myself was traumatized, but I just knew I left angry. Like I said, I mean angry. And I was available to any radio station or television station that wanted me to talk about it, and many of them did. But I was just talking about what I had seen, and the anger was directed at, of course, the regime. So was I traumatized? I don't know. But I do think Iraq today is a deeply traumatized society. You can't come out of 35 years of this kind of regime. 35 years, that's the longest time that any regime has been in power in Iraq since the modern state of Iraq has been created, by far, by a whole margin, huge margin. 35 years. The monarchy had barely lasted, 32 to 58, or 16 years, or whatever that is. So you can't come out of 35 years of that kind of regime and not be traumatized.
Thank you so much, Professor Makiya. I want to go back and follow up on the question Professor Rabat asked on the position of the Arab diaspora intellectuals that you and Professor Rabat found yourself in, and many others you mentioned in the talk about people like Daud Said, Fuad Ajami, Sadiq Jalal at certain point of his age. And this is something I find myself have to deal with as a much younger, I think maybe generation, me and my colleagues as well. But and you're right on Said. He tells us post 9/11 how he became the spokesperson of the Islam, of culture, of the Arabs, and like American media discovered him, and he was requested to do all these interviews, and he was bothered by it. Like he wasn't actually in the position of saying many of that. But what I wanted to ask you, since you're someone who actually saw the trajectory, let's say from the 60s onward, of Arab thought in the diaspora, and how that actually is vital and shaped the Arab thought actually also in the Arab world throughout the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Where do you see that going now? I mean, if we can talk about an Arab thought in the diaspora, or Arab intellectuals, let's say, in the diaspora, do you see it going anywhere? Do you see it like does it still have any project going on? Is there any hope, let's say, in this?
Let me answer this way. With the exception of the names that I mentioned, Edward, Sadiq, and Fuad Ajami, the rest of the Arabs who happened to live in the diaspora didn't necessarily depart. Their point of departure was not the presence in the diaspora. They were thinking about the Arab world per se. Whatever they wrote was directed towards other Arabs in the Arab world. They were not directing themselves to the fact of their existence in America. So, therein is a big, so they were part of the discourse that was, they happened to be able to write books and publish them better outside the Arab world than inside the Arab world. Yes, for that reason, they were very important. But they wrote in all sorts of language. Some of the best books nowadays that are coming out about the Arab world are not even written in Arabic anymore. The state of Arabic publishing is really bad. So what I'm trying to say is, with the exception of those, and perhaps myself being trapped into it, being drawn into it by just the way the media works in this country. I mean, I'm not criticizing it even. I mean, it's just the way America sucks up it sucks up people like the Black Panthers and then turns them into something else the next day. It sucks up. American culture is like that. It's quite remarkable in that way. So it's very important to know what one's point of departure is. If you're talking about a discourse whose object is the state of the Arab world and transforming that for the better in one way or another, that's one thing. But if you're talking about an Arab-American discourse today, now it's a very real thing because of Gaza. I mean, now this is a turning point. I don't know where this will go, but what's happening in Gaza is going to be extremely important. I can't think of anybody who's not thinking about that at this point in time. But there isn't yet, or maybe you can correct me, there are lots of, for instance, novels being written by Arabs in English, or, for example, or in Arabic even, outside of the Arab world, where insofar as it's about, but there is not yet an Arab-American intellectual discourse in and of itself. The way there is, for instance, a discourse amongst Black Americans and the intelligentsia of Black America, which has a huge body of work around its existence naturally because of slavery. that has a huge body of work directly connected to the very fabric of this country and how it works and how it changes and so on and so forth. That we don't yet have. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we don't yet have. We have individuals who did different things and who were then picked up and used because of the absence of a lot of Arab American voices. And I would hope, and I'm hoping, that absence is changing. It's being filled now. There's a lot more Arab Americans. I mean, I was here in 67 war. So we had, there is no comparison to the level of political activity around the Palestinian question now compared to 67, 68 when I was here, 69. No comparison. It's not even, I mean, there were 4 Arabs in MIT when I came here. I mean, one of them was Iraqi. I mean, how many are there now? Was it several hundred at least? I mean, so they form a community. Our Arab American society here in MIT was headed by Ismail Sarajuddin, you may know. So it was tiny. It was minuscule. John Mahul is here. He can perhaps, he was part of it too. So he would know more than I actually on this. So what I'm saying is we don't yet have something I can call an Arab American discourse around which we have texts and arguments and different debates and possibly even publications. And that's what makes this endeavor of the Center for Arab Culture so important. And actually, I thought of it for many years. I was here many years, but I was not really a part of it the way I sort of have become, I hope to become now, because I thought it was just about teaching Arabic for young kids and so on and so forth. But if this series continues, this might be a bridge towards becoming a sort of a tool for encouraging exactly that kind of culture of Arab Americans speaking as Arab Americans, meaning they're speaking to America as Arab Americans, not just about the Arab world, but about their own affairs and about the discrimination they suffer. I don't know if I answered that. Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's on. Okay. It's more of a comment than a question, but
Sure.
with a request that perhaps you correct me if I'm wrong. You took us through a thrilling journey through times and memories that we would like to either cherish or perish. From the grounds of Baghdad College, to your exit from architecture, to the books, to your re-entry into Iraq. And what the question that I had in my mind as part of the audience was, what kept him going? And I think you answered it in the last word, love.
Thank you.
And then I had another question that you answered in answer to Professor Rabat, namely love to what? And I gather it's love to the country that gave
Yes.
an English expat a new family and a new home.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're right.
Actually, I have a question, Professor.
Sure.
You mentioned when you wrote The Republic of Fear that you wrote it while angry.
Cruelty and silence.
Cruelty and silence, I'm sorry. And you also mentioned, talking about Dostoevsky, that Saddam, or metaphorically, we can apply it to all rulers, dictators in the Arab world, unfortunately, that they are the demon in every one of the country. This thought comes at times like, what's the balance between feeling sorry for the people, for the circumstances that are applied to them, or held them accountable for the rulers that have been ruling them for a very long time? From your perspective and from your experience, where is the balance?
That's a really nice question.
Thank you.
So, first, let me make just one observation. When I made that comment about Republic of Fear, namely that it is a book that addressed the demons within us, I was indirectly, therefore, talking about accountability and responsibility for this regime. You see, there is nothing that not only Iraqis, but peoples in general, certainly Kurds and Shia like to do this, and Sunnis, they like to say, it's not us. We had a tyrant, and we and the tyrant are two different things. But you see, and here's the thing, an extremely high percentage of the Iraqis who read Republic of Fear, I mean, really read it, who talked about Republic of Fear, thought it was a book which was only about the ugliness of Saddam. So they have nothing to do with it. But when you look carefully, when you look at, by the way, certain peculiarities of the way the Iraqi state worked, of the importance of oil revenues. Oil revenues subsidized a security apparatus by itself of about 650,000 people, which I actually arrive at that number in Republic of Fear, who, if you multiply by 4 or 5, and in Iraq there was 16 million or so back then in the 1980s, early 1980s, is a substantial portion. Then if you add to that 667,000 is the figure I arrived at, the people who served in the army. Now, they didn't want to serve, maybe they had to serve. I'm not blaming them. It's not about blame. It's about taking responsibility. You see, come 2003, all of a sudden, like a magic wand is waved and the dictator is gone without any effort on the part of Iraqis. And all these Iraqis who were, from various tiny little organizations here, there, and everywhere, actually, talk about it as though they themselves got rid of Saddam, number one. And number two, they start blaming each other. What's the name of the game in politics in Iraq after 2003? The name of the game is who suffered the most under Saddam. So the Kurds will say, I suffered more than anybody else. They said, therefore, the trial of Saddam on the Anfal should be first, and everything else should be second. The Shia said, no, we suffered more than you. We suffered. So no, the trial on Dujir, where 182 people were killed, that's the suffering. And the so-called system of muhasasa, which it means subdivision according to sex and groups and parties and blocks, is a system designed to throw the blame on somebody else. That is not what Republic of Fear was about, which is, not if you read it properly, not if you read it academically. That's not the argument I'm making. It's not a book about how terrible Saddam is. That's taken for granted. That's too easy that doesn't even require a book. So, I mean, it's like, Bashar al-Assad, it's self-evident. The deeper question is, how did we sustain for 35 years? How is it that most countries that go through terrible wars, like the 8-year war with Iran, end up at the end, which you can't really call an Iraqi victory, it was not, where the 1 million people died. 1 million people means a million taken into 50 million, because there were 35 million Iranians and 15 to 18 million Iraqis. If you take a percentage of the number of people, it's 2% of the population. What 2% of the population was killed in the war? World War I, on average, apart from Germany, which lost more than everybody else, but on average, England, France, other countries that participated in World War I lost about 2% of the population. They call it World War, and it changed history. The England after World War I is not the same as the England. And by the way, that's true of Iraq. The Iraq after the Iraq-Iran war is a totally different place than the Iraq before it, because not only because of it was an enormous social transformation. So I have always been one who has pushed against the idea that other people are responsible for and that's one of the reasons why I always end up in a minority. It's always why I end up on the margin, because I insist that is true, that And in Cruelty and Silence, the book, that there is one story about its chapters are told through the witnesses, as I said, the people, the victim. So in one case, there's one victim who was in a party. He's a Sunni, and he is informed upon by others to having said something bad about Saddam. So he's taken in for interrogation and so on. He's a Sunni. His interrogator, the harsh one, the one who really, hurt him, was a Shia. And the person who informed was a Kurd. So, so I put that chapter in thinking it was self-evident if somebody read the chapter that the responsibility cannot be apportioned in that way. But I put it in for that reason, but very, 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 very few people read it that way. So I think, and this is now getting to a broader question, it's a cultural question. It is our political culture that has been stabbed through the heart since 1967. And it was expressed in the critiques at the very earliest, the very first expressions of it were in the criticisms that were made of Sadiq al-Alam's book for writing such a book, for exposing our dirty laundry, which he did. He talked about the state of the Egyptian army. He talked about the leadership, the mentality of the officers that were there. But unfortunately, the trajectory that he represented in that book, which was heavily discussed at his time in the Arab world, was cut off. And I want to say that my gut instinct, or rather what I have become, and maybe I'm just too old to see that we've already crossed this border. This is a deep, deep problem of political culture. Not culture is complicated; it has all sorts of our political culture is wanting in being able to take responsibility for its own failures, and that's as true of Iraq as it is of the Arab world, Mashriq especially at large. So I don't know if I.
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure.
Any other questions? Yeah, yours. I'm sorry. Oh, yes.
Well, thank you very much for all this insight and give us what you call it, the more objective and scientific approach to what's happening in the Arab world. I would just like to mention one thing just to put us on some bright side, which is regardless what the sects, the Arabs are, and the people of the area there, it's generosity, curiosity, and protection, even for the strangers and for the foreigners, is still there. And this culture, if we set aside the politics, it's still there and it's still healthy. And I'm sure if your mother comes now to any Arab world or any Arab country, she will be very welcome and everybody will hug her.
I agree.
Thank you.
I fully agree.
Any other questions? I'm sorry.
Thank you for your talk. A curiosity. What triggered, at a certain point you were working in your father's office, and it's a very successful office. And I guess in early 80s, you were working on the mosque in Kuwait and you decided to quit. What was your motivation behind this decision?
Okay. First, yeah, no, it's a very important question, and I didn't address it. So, key thing was I didn't want him to go back and work for Saddam. My father, as I said, was a persona non grata all through the 70s. Suddenly, Saddam decided, after he had assumed the presidency, having purged all his fellow members of the Revolutionary Command Council, having assumed the presidency, he decided he wanted a new face to transform the face of Baghdad. He was planning the Iraq-Iran war, but nobody knew about that. It hadn't happened yet. And so they called for, also, it turns out, I know from friends of my father's who told me this story, who had been in Iraq during the time, he had gone and prayed in the Khulafa Mosque, which is one of the mosques that the Aga Khan Documentation Center has already put up in part on its website. So, and he had liked the mosque. This is, the design of the mosque we put aside for a moment. So he asked, where's this architect? This is late 70s, early 1980, before the start of the Iraq-Iran war. They told him he's in exile and he's persona non grata. Okay, who else is here? Well, our other great architect is Rafat Chadirchi, but where is he? He's in prison. So what did they do? So when I was running the office, we got a phone call. The secretary, thank God, took it. Why? Because it was a member of the Revolutionary Command Council. I was in such consternation, I even forget which one it was. I forget the name. His name. He called, he said he would like to speak to Dr. Makiya. So she came, of course, to me right away. They want to speak to your father. I said, this is like electricity running through you, what's going on? So I didn't take the phone. No, I took the phone and I apologized. I said, my father's not in the office. He's not feeling well, etc. They said, he said, let me tell you, we want to invite him to come to Baghdad for consultations about the new face of Baghdad. We're going to transform Baghdad. So I said, thank you very much. And we shut the phone. There was then a family crisis, emergency meeting, including, people to advise us. Should he go? Should he not go? So I was dead set against it. My father conceded, and I wrote back a very polite telex in those days, a very polite telex, thanking them very much for the deep honor, blah, 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 that they had conferred, etc. But my father was too old, and he had really withdrawn from stuff like that, and apologized. So he wouldn't come. They wouldn't take no for an answer. So this time, they sent, they called again. They called or sent telexes. They sent a telex and then they called again. And I did not take the phone. But this time they said, tell Dr. Makiya. They paid no attention to all the excuses that, he's sick, he's old, he's retiring, all that they realized it was all nonsense. So they said, we would like to tell you the past is forgotten. You will get a red carpet treatment. I swear to God, they use the phrase red carpet treatment from the airport. You will be taken in through the, somebody will steer you through the airport. We will take complete care of you, etc. But please come. This is, you are needed. Your country needs you. Baghdad needs you. Now, that's the way to get to my father, to tell him Baghdad needs him. So we had another emergency meeting. I strongly disagree. Now, the irony in all of this, and he decided he would go. He went there. I can describe the event. Part of it is described in a New Yorker article, if you're interested, dates to January 1992. It's the story of this is told. And I tell it in one of my books, not one of the ones I mentioned here. He goes. The first day, there are invitees from all over the world, consultants of the highest level, American, French, you name it. High-level consultants everywhere. My father's there. They asked my father to give a talk. So he gives his talk about the importance of heritage, etc., his buildings and so on. And Saddam is sitting there listening. Then when my father finishes, Saddam stands up. Now, that's considered amazing. That means when he had finished talking, clapping us all over and so on. Saddam stood up and shook his hand. That's a big deal. So you know what was going on. The second day of the conference. Saddam doesn't show, but he is the whole government is attending. Every minister is there. All the DGs and so on and so forth, director generals of this or that department are there. And Saddam's not there. How can they start the conference with Saddam's own conference and he's not there? They wait 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And then they say, they bring they show a big screen and television. And Saddam is now not dressed in the perfect Pierre Cardin suit with, immaculately dressed and so on and so forth. No, he's in battle fatigues. And he's announcing the start of the Iraq-Iran war. Second day of the conference for the reconstruction of Baghdad. So the whole thing ends in a mess, etc. But my father does have meetings. And he says they ask him to manage. In other words, they ask him to do what Rafat ended up doing in the end. He says, no, I would like to design. And I want only one condition. I want to work from outside Iraq and come and go. So, protecting, he had a sense of self-protection, thank God. So I want to participate. And he participated in many big schemes. Now, I disapproved of this work. And I told him if he was going, he said, this is Baghdad, this is my city. I'm not building for them. I'm building for the future. This is for the people of Iraq and so on. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not saying I was right. I'm not saying life is complicated, but I took a stand. I'm leaving. I brought somebody in to replace me, Gary Martin, an architect. I stayed 1 year just to sort of facilitate his taking over the reins of the office. And then I came to America and wrote Republic of Fear. So it was life, complicated.
Any more questions? For the sake of time, we'll have this question and probably another question.
Just a quick one. Nobody figured out who was Samir Sharif.
Nobody did. No. Well, there were really only 4 people who knew. My wife then, Afsani Najmabadi, sitting over there, and a couple of other good friends. And I was in total isolation first in New York for 8-9 months, and then in Cambridge when Afsani started working here. And I wasn't in most of the Iraqis I met and now are my very good friends, like Kanan Hassani over there, Anwar Khawla, and others. All of them I met on the day I went public, which was actually March 6th, I think, 1991, at the CM, Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard. I was in isolation. I mean, not deliberately, it had become the mode of my life for 6 years, for a number of years. But I started doing things when the book was published. I started showing up on TV from angles where they couldn't see my face and so on and so forth. But well, thank you all very much. Thank you for the questions. Thanks.